Can everybody see the screen? Has it come up for everyone?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So we're going to rattle through some of these at a fair pace, gang, but purely because of the time that we've lost this morning, okay? But I don't want that to affect anybody's understanding. So if you have got any questions, then please do speak up. I'd say put your thumbs up or something, but I've only got a view of so many of you in the screen, so I might not see you and I don't want to lose you. So just speak up and join in and ask whatever you need to, because I want you to be really clear about everything going away from today. So as we mentioned a couple of times this morning, we've talked about legislation and we said that it changes, and we acknowledge that it's important and it underpins arguably everything that we do. So there's a number of examples, and I think most of you are on laptops today, but if you are on a mobile phone, I appreciate that's not the easiest to see because there's lots of things on there. But just to reflect through that list really and see the number of different pieces of legislation that affects safeguarding and child protection, and it's highlighted arguably the two most important bits out of all of that. That first one being the Children's Act 2004, okay, which obviously is important when we're dealing with children, and then it highlights the Care Act 2014, and that reflects on the work we do with adults. All right, so what you'll notice about, well, there's a couple of observations. Has anybody got any observations about those two different pieces of legislation, just seeing it like that?
The age.
The age? Go on, Joanne, what do you mean?
Just the Children's Act, I'm guessing that since 2004 it does get updated.
That's the most recent Children's Acts. There were other Children's Acts prior to that.
Right.
So that's the most recent, if you like. Just because that's legislation doesn't mean there's not updated guidance. It just might not sit in legislation. So we've got different things like working together and stuff that we have as well. And you know, if you work within children, you might hear about working together in education and all that type of stuff. So there's different guidance that might be put out, but that might not be enshrined in legislation as such. That's the most recent one. Do we notice the distinction in kind of age between the legislation for children and that with adults?
Well, the 10-year difference, you mean?
We had to wait 10 years to get the relative legislation in place to safeguard adults in the same way. And it didn't actually come into force until 2015. So it's only been the last 5 years that, you know, we've had a fairly all-encompassing act that reflects on safeguarding adults. So, when we look at children, I know a lot of you work with adults, so I'm not going to labour the point too much. Does anybody remember Every Child Matters?
Yeah. I've never heard of it before.
No. It might be something that's a point of reference for you. If you want to do a bit of reading, just do a bit of history on Every Child Matters. And obviously there's the excerpt there from section 11, which places a duty. That's from the Children's Act. So that's where it places a duty on a range of organisations and individuals to ensure that their functions and any services are discharged having regard to the need to safeguard and promote welfare of children. All right. And that comes out of that working together guidance as well. So it's pulled together, and that's changed over time about what our responsibilities are, and arguably drawn in more organisations to being responsible for children that arguably may not have been referenced initially before that act. So it's really important that we're aware of our obligations in terms of acts. We also look at the creation of local safeguarding children's boards, as was, and their equivalents, local safeguarding adults boards. So whichever group of people, or if you go across the piece of children and adults, please familiarise yourself on what those local safeguarding boards are for you in your location. Just do a bit of a Google search with it. Obviously, there has been a change recently, and they've moved towards being called local safeguarding partnerships in some cases, or some have still retained the kind of title of children's boards and adults boards and stuff like that. So just be mindful that there's a bit of a terminology kind of interchangeability on that one. But go have a look. Every Child Matters came out a number of years ago, and arguably was it in response to the Victoria Climbié case. And for those that aren't aware of that, in fact, let me give you some brief details while we're on it now, just so I get all the info right, because invariably memories fade and whatnot. But yeah, it goes back to, let's have a look. Yeah, 2000 was Victoria's case, and she died in 2000 in London. For those that I think there's a couple of you that are based in Haringey. I'm sure this is something fairly well known to you, because unfortunately Haringey has been named in a couple of serious case reviews that are fairly well known. Yeah. You don't hear the end of it down your way, do you not?
Nope, every day, more or less.
Yeah. Unfortunately, go on, sorry.
No, it's just one of those things that comes up in like the assessments that we do every day.
Yeah.
In regards to, do you give your consent to us making checks on social services with those? Yeah. So it's like every day.
Yeah, but basically, Victoria was born in 1991 on the Ivory Coast, and she died in February 2000 in London, aged 8. To escape poverty of Africa, her parents entrusted her to a great aunt who brought her to Europe. Victoria was tortured to death by that great aunt and the woman's boyfriend. Police, doctors, social workers all had contact with her while she was being abused, and she died having had 128 injuries. So it's really significant. And obviously, that being in 2000, there was a number of things that came off the back of that, and one of them was Every Child Matters, and the other one was Working Towards the Children Act, which was published in 2004. For anybody that was involved in youth work back in the day, and certainly anybody involved in children's services, Every Child Matters was a big deal. And even as a youth worker, I used to have to, every session that I devised and I delivered, had to have the elements of the Every Child Matters kind of points, and there was five distinct points out of Every Child Matters that they referenced as being essential for every young person to kind of work on to I guess get them to thrive. I'm quickly looking through my notes because I made a note of them, but they're stay safe, be healthy, enjoy and achieve economic well-being, and make a positive contribution. And those are the 5 tenets of that that Every Child Matters stuff. So if that interests you, or it's something you kind of comes to mind, then do have a look into it. But obviously the main thing we need to take from the legislation is we have a duty to act. No action is not an option. All right, and in this case we're talking about children, but that applies to adults just as much. All right, especially when we're in frontline services, we have to take the action. If we are seeing some of those indicators, if somebody has disclosed information to us, we have an absolute obligation to do something about it. Okay, we all good? Okay, so the equivalent acts, and one we mentioned is the Care Act, and these give us a bit of background as to what that looks like. So it looks into any worries about adults who need support and may be at risk of abuse, neglect, domestic violence, and take action to protect them. All right, so it's saying we need to identify those issues. It talks about the setting up of a safeguarding adults board. So those have only been in existence for 5 years, which to me is pretty shocking, really, considering that we thought about this for children over 10 years before that, and we set up boards for them years back. But we're only just getting around to it 5 years ago for adults, all right? And the core people that sit on those boards, as it says on there, are the council, the police and the NHS, all right? And those are your decision makers on those boards about what action can be taken to safeguard those particular children, okay? And it talks about independent advocates to support adults going through that process, because there might be an inquiry going on, there might be a review going on, and obviously we need, if that person is being seen as an adult at risk, then we obviously need to provide them an advocate and some support, as we would do, you know, with a child. The equivalent is due for an adult. And it talks about cooperating with partners, which everything to do, you know, with adults at risk and children that are subject to safeguarding concerns or child protection concerns. It's so important. I think, you know, I haven't failed to see a serious case review, an adult review, you know, that hasn't said we could have worked better with more collaboration, with talking to other agencies, with about sharing information, which is what it comes down to. Things things might have looked different. There might have been better outcomes. So it's really important that cooperation with partners in order to protect that adult that has, and again, as we said before, the tenet of the Act is about those care and support needs, and in this, who is experiencing or at risk of experiencing that abuse or neglect. Any comments or thoughts? No, stunned silence. Also, we'll move on. Okay, so in the work that you were doing in your groups, you've hopefully identified some of the categories of abuse, and some of them are here for you. So we're going to run through them briefly, and we'll look at the different elements of each of them anyway. But obviously, why do you think emotional abuse is kind of represented in that way?
Because it's all of that.
All of them.
Yeah, it underpins everything. You know, if you can't fail to be affected on an emotional level, can you? Regardless of what else is going on, if you know, if you're being hurt physically, if you're subject to sexual abuse, then that's ultimately is going to have a huge effect on your emotions. So that emotional abuse is, I would say, pretty much always present. I've not found a case where it hasn't been. It's always present when other things are going on. So we need to be mindful that whether it's directed in that way, whether it's explicit that that's emotional abuse, you know, we need to be aware that it's there. So the other ones, it talks about physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and so those are the ones that we talk about when it refers to children. So emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect. There's another subject that's on there. There's certainly with my NSPCC hat on that we mention, there's not a direct category of abuse that's identified in legislation, but is arguably quite troubling for children to manage and deal with. Can anybody tell me what that might be? Talked about in schools quite a lot.
Bullying.
Yeah. Yeah. So the other one that I would talk about with NSPCC when I go into schools is that bullying element, because whilst we acknowledge that yes, bullying can come in lots of different ways, it might be emotional, it might be physical, it might be sexual, it might, you know, there might be lots of things underpinning it. We need to recognise it, that that's a real issue for some children and young people, and arguably adults as well. All right. So then we talk about the different ones. We've got financial on there, modern slavery, discrimination, domestic abuse. Because sometimes we mention that terminology, don't we? What did we kind of use to call that?
What?
Domestic violence.
Yeah, thank you, Ollie. Yeah, we would the terminology would kind of be more around domestic violence. Anybody want to kind of throw in why that change has come about?
Because it's not just violence that happens in the home in the physical sense. It can be any kind of abuse that a partner or whomever that's living in that house, child, partner, whatever, can be experiencing any kind of abuse in the domestic setting.
Absolutely. So it's you know, it doesn't have to be of a violent nature, does it? More legislation has come to the fore and talks about coercive control and understanding the dynamics. Might be abusive. You know, we might not be physically being hurt in a domestic setting, but for abuse to be occurring. All right. So we need to acknowledge that kind of change in terminology, really.
Is that the one that came out only a few years ago?
Say that again, Tony.
Is that the one that only just came out a few years ago? Where they added it?
I think it's an evolution in terms of a lot of the language that we use around different terminology, I think. But we have added different pieces of legislation to bring in different criminal offences around domestic abuse. So I think that's kind of, over the last few years, there's been kind of a movement towards that term domestic abuse rather than domestic violence, because in recognition that it doesn't just have to be violence that's abusive within the home. So I think that there's both a legislative change in terms of the criminal acts that can now be, you know, people can be, losing my words, convicted of, but also that recognition, I guess, across the board. Is that all right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it talks about exploitation, and that can be of lots of different kinds, but a lot of the times we talk about sexual exploitation. Talks about organisational. What did we used to call organisational? searching for the thing now because I can't quite remember.
Well, do you mean institutional?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Yep, the word went out of my head then. Thank you, Ola. So yeah, absolutely. What we would have termed institutional, we now look at as a more organisational thing, and we'll look at that in just a moment. And then there's also the term self-neglect. Yeah. So we recognise that neglect can be done unto us, if you like. But actually, when we look at adults, and that blue slip, it is about those adult descriptors of abuse, that actually, abuse can be perpetrated upon ourselves in that sense. All right. So having a look through what these are and what they look like. Bear with me. Just make sure I don't overshoot. Make sure, yep, that's the last one. So these are examples of the different types of emotional and what we could also term psychological abuse. Is there anything that sticks out for anybody there? There was changes implemented in 2014 that refer to emotional cruelty as well. So we can see that kind of element of cruelty and abuse can, it's recognising that that's an issue, that we need to take it seriously. So that's been a terminology change and a legislative change as well. So that's a crime for the first time. And it says parents found guilty under the law could face up to 10 years in prison, the maximum term in child neglect cases. So that's interesting, isn't it? That's quite a hefty potential sentence for people. I imagine proving that in a court might be a challenge. Yeah. But certainly the legislation is there to back it. Okay. So next one we can look is physical abuse. And again, when we go back to the Victoria Climbié case, that there was numerous physical signs of abuse on Victoria, and when we look at baby P as well, there was in some cases, I think when the social worker tipped up, there was chocolate smeared over his face to cover the bruises, and in some cases, I don't know whether it was that case off the top of my head or another one, but where the Sudocrem. So for those who haven't used it, really it's a thick white cream, isn't it? So it's quite good coverage in terms of covering injuries and whatnot. So sometimes those types of things is what we might see in terms of trying to shield that from the professional. Any comments on that one, gang? Nope. Okay. So the question is, who is the offender?
Potentially all of them.
Yep, all of those have been convicted of abuse of one variety or another. And can anybody hazard a guess as to what the percentage is of sexual abuse that's committed by family or friends, people known to the victim?
High. 67.
Quite high.
70.
I'd go 90.
85.
85.
85% of sexual abuse is perpetrated by somebody known to the victim, which is staggering, really. I'm not sure it's shocking, but it certainly is staggering, isn't it? That the people that can cause the most harm to us are those that are known to us in one variety or another. But yeah, all of those people in the picture on the screen are perpetrators of abuse, one variety or another. So hopefully it might challenge our stereotypes. Because whether we like it or not, I think crimes perpetrated by women can sometimes be seen as quite shocking, especially when it comes to the more serious end of things, whether it's sexual abuse or anything like that. Because women may be seen as the carer, the nurturing, all of that kind of things that conjures up within us, but they're absolutely have the same, potential to commit offences, whether it's abuse or any others. For those working in the female estate, they'll know that better than most. Having worked in a female jail myself, I'm telling you, it beggars belief, really.
It's surprising.
It can be, Rachel, can't it? Why would you
Yep.
say that?
It's because, like you say, you never expect it, but the amount actually that do harm others,
Yeah.
women especially, is proportionately quite high.
Yeah.
Especially kind of within hours, but there are also women that have been hurt themselves. So it's kind of, they've been hurt themselves and they haven't known how then to manage when, so they've gone on to, it's like they're copying the behaviour that they've learned.
And I think that goes for a lot of abuse. I think what you'll find, especially when it comes to sexual abuse, and we might come to a stat, I'm sorry, in terms of retaining statistics, I'm not brilliant, if I'm honest. Overarching principles, great. Statistics, not so great. But we'll come up against, I'm sure there is a stat at some point on the presentation today which looks at, when it comes to sexual abuse, the prevalence of, if you suffered as a victim, you know, the percentage of people that go on to be the perpetrator of sexual abuse is significantly high. You know, when you reflect on the general population. So I think that could be said across the board, Rachel. But I think you're absolutely right. You know, a lot of people in prisons have been abused, haven't they? And they've suffered at the hands of other people, whether it's parents, whether it's partners, whether it's the system or whatever. Unfortunately, they're stuck in a cycle, aren't they?
Yeah.
I think the people in the outside world who don't necessarily see this side of it, the female is the nurturer, so they struggle to get their head around how a female could abuse another, because they're the kind of, they safely grow the baby, and they're seen as that maternal figure. And it's really old-fashioned to say it, but it's unbelievable the amount of people that still have that belief that women don't abuse, especially sexual abuse.
That's the bit I can't get my head around.
Go on, Tony, what are you saying?
That's the bit I can't get my head around.
Which bit?
Women sexually abusing it's just, I don't know, it's just.
And that's where we need to reflect on our own values and our own kind of standpoint on things, isn't it? And when we struggle to kind of understand something, I guess for me, and I can only reflect on how I manage stuff like that, is about doing some digging and find out and challenging my perspective a little bit. Because obviously, again, the blooming woman's name completely eludes me, but there was the case a few years ago where it was in nursery, and the woman was perpetrating abuse against some really young wee children. Down on the south coast, wasn't it? Does anybody know the case off the top of the head?
Vanessa, somebody, wasn't
remember her name.
No, we can't remember it coming out. But you know the case I'm talking. You know, so you can go and you can find the cases because they are undoubtedly there. And whilst I totally understand, Tony, that to get around our kind of social conditioning in some senses, isn't it? Are these kind of roles we have within society? And we're going to have a look at domestic abuse a bit later on today and kind of challenge our perspective because we hear, you know, the perpetrators of abuse, and what we get told is that the perpetrators are male.
Yeah.
But we're going to have a look and put a different spin on that as the women as the perpetrators of domestic abuse as well.
Well, it's not a new thing, is it? Look at Rose West.
Exactly. Myra Hindley.
Rose West, Myra Hindley. Rose West was apparently the driver behind it. Whether that's true or not, we'll never know. But that goes back, Myra Hindley, even further back than that.
Yeah,
so
there's some deeply deviant behaviour, and that's on both males and females' part. I think it does challenge the social norms.
No, it was just when I was working in Staffordshire, I used to do when they were given bail and put them in a bail hostel.
Yeah.
Never came across a woman.
No.
There was never a woman on my list.
Was it a mixed hostel though? Was it a mixed hostel, or was it just a male hostel? Because that might have been rich.
Saying that, yeah. No, it's just a case of like.
Sometimes it's not good to mix, Tony.
Yeah, no. I'm just saying, like when you're in the courts and you're sitting there listening, and I don't think I've ever come across a case where there was a woman involved.
Yeah.
Even though I had to rehouse and put them in the hostels and that, it's just I can't remember a woman. I really can't. But
yeah, and if you're not working in services that are targeted towards family or women, then arguably that's not going to be your experience, and that's okay. All I would suggest.
No, it's just in the sense of like being in the actual courtroom.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, doing that, putting them into accommodation, yeah, I get that because it was all male accommodation, but actually seeing someone being brought into the courtroom, a female, for that.
I think it's because there's a male prison in Stafford, isn't there? Well, I think it's a predominantly male, or maybe just male prison in Stafford for sexual offenders.
Right. So geographics play a part, the services we're part of, and I guess our exposure to it is another one. But yeah, having worked with females on in a female jail and on a female project, a female offenders project, I'm telling you, they're out there, Tony. Lots of them. Yeah, and it's really interesting. And I think if you do work in the female estate, I don't know whether any of you that's on, have you got a mother and baby unit at any of your prisons?
No, I think Newall's the only mother and baby unit.
Is it the only surviving one now?
So.
Askham Grange still got one?
I don't think so, because that's the open prison now.
Wow. Yeah, it was always open, but I'm pretty sure that they went from Newhall to Askham. But yeah, we have mother and baby unit and everything, which challenges every norm you can, as a female offender that's then in a nurturing role, and it's all these different things that you can be exposed to, and it's really interesting. So look at Tony's face, he's like, oh my.
So I'm used to it.
Do you think they do it because, and then they think to themselves, I can do it, but I might be able to get away with it because I'm a woman?
I think that could be it in some sense, Maxine. I think there's a potential for that. They might feel they're going under the radar. I think there's so many reasons why people perpetrate offences. It's really hard to get into it. But I think that everybody's got different motivators and drivers. And if a girl or a woman is abused, then they're just as likely to see that as norm and learned behaviour as men do.
But I also think we miss the telltale signs. I think naturally, if there's abuse, our first port of call is never the mother. And if anybody watched The Bodyguard, the series on TV, and it starts with a woman on a train, and her husband gets off the train, and she's holding a bomb, and everybody goes, and we think right up until the last moment, pretty much, that her husband is the suicide bomber, and actually he wasn't. It was her. Yeah. And you all got caught up, and you check yourself and think, shouldn't have made that assumption, but you just jumped to it straight away. She looked vulnerable, the doe eyes, and it was my husband, and we all felt for her. And actually, it was a poor husband that was the victim.
Yeah.
And
I think that just is a brilliant example of how we have to kind of check and challenge our own kind of perspectives, our own values. Because we take that with us to our clients, don't we? We carry that with us all the time. And like Steph says, if we're going in with a preconceived notion of who's the victim and who's the perpetrator, then that could really interrupt our thinking, our assessment of a situation, and ultimately what our response is going to be. So we really need to check and challenge those things within us to make sure that our viewpoint is a rounded one. And what else do we think can help us with that?
I think as well, it's quite hard. For me in particular, I'm a mom of 2 children, and I know what I see as normal and as acceptable behaviour towards children. And so you would automatically assume that any other parent or any other mother, to an extent, has those same feelings and values and ideas about what is and what isn't acceptable. And then to find out that actually that person doesn't share those values and ideas about what's acceptable, it just sometimes can blow your mind, and you wouldn't necessarily be accepting of the idea that they don't think the same way as you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because we're all coming from a different frame of reference, aren't we? And as we all very well know, as parents and as aunties or uncles, an extended family, nobody hands you a handbook today in that delivery room. And we're all a result of our own upbringing, the way we were brought up, the experience of those around us, so where, we might have seen other children being parented, grandparents, and there's cultural elements to it as well, isn't there? There's so many layers to it that we need to peel those back and have a really clear and frank conversations really with people to say about this is what we expect, because if we assume they understand what you expect, then as you absolutely point out, Frankie, it's going to blow your mind and they're never going to be able to reach those expectations, are they?
The golden rule is basically to never assume, isn't it?
Yeah. And that's really challenging, isn't it? It's like saying we shouldn't be judgmental. Well, we shouldn't be, but we know we are. We make judgments every day, and actually judgments keep us safe. So we need to recognise that actually we do need to, we have to make assessments of things, don't we? And on the back of that, we are going to make judgments. But as long as we challenge that, it's about that level of check and challenge, isn't it? And that's why I was kind of saying how else can we do that? And I would suggest that's by talking to colleagues. Yeah. So we're exploring our viewpoint and kind of going, I think this is what I expect out of this situation, and this is what I would really like from my client. What would you expect them to do in that circumstance? And they go, actually, I would expect X, Y, and Z, because you haven't been very clear about that. And you go, oh, do you know what? Actually, that's a really interesting point. Supervision is another really good tool, isn't it?
Yeah.
And now whether that's formal, informal, whether it's with your colleague, it's your boss, whether it's a bit of reflection at home, whether it's writing something down and rereading it and going through it, those different elements that supervision and being reflective can be, is just to bring in that level of check and challenge, so that if we are going down a road and we might truly believe it's right, we might be getting a little bit tunnel visioned in our practice, mightn't we?
That's why I think multi-agency working is the safest way.
I absolutely agree with you. And for anybody who's worked in a multi-agency team, I can only see the positives. Especially my best experience of that was working at youth offending teams, where we had police, probation, social workers, health, everybody known to man that was in and around those young people, to be able to bring, because we're all the product of the services we're part of as well, aren't we? So it's really important to recognise that level of maybe personal bias, and acknowledge that within us and make sure that we temper that appropriately. And there's lots of different ways that we can do that, like I've said. Some really good points there, Gary. Thanks for joining in with that, because that's really important to get some different reflections. Okay, so going back to the different types of abuse. Yeah, I know I was going one too far. So when we talk about sexual abuse, that's what we're thinking of. Okay. Any comments or reflections?
I just think the use of sexual abuse is a sense of power towards the person who's the abused and the victim. Like,
I think that could be said, Maxine.
It's control over them, isn't it? And especially like when you're young as well, when like you're a child, you don't know what's right and what's wrong. And with them being an adult, it's like when you're an adult and you're doing this, it's like a sense of power, isn't it, over the child? And I mean, I know like it's not just children that get sexually abused, it's a lot of women as well, but I put it down to being
and men, I'd like
power.
to put in there. But yeah, I think there's a lot of power dynamics when it comes to abuse. I think that's an absolute fair assessment, and I think it's about our ability to consent and our understanding about what we're consenting to.
Yeah. When you're a young child, you don't know nothing about sex or anything like that, and as well as the grown up takes the innocence away from the child.
Potentially, there's lots of adults that know nothing either, Maxine. Just again to balance and make sure we're kind of thinking of it from both angles and challenging kind of our thinking about it. Is actually, when it comes to sexual abuse, there's plenty of adults that are arguably powerless in those situations as well. Just because we're that bit older, I'm not decrying your point. It's a really good one. When we look at the kind of situations where abuse is perpetrated on a child, and that can be from another child in some cases, from a teenager, from an adult. Again, we need to think about it in the round about who the perpetrator of these offences are, and check and challenge our response, because you know, invariably it can be another child, whether it's their age, a little bit older. That's not unheard of. Yeah.
Well, you hear of like bullying, don't you? When you have a bully at school or anywhere, it's like then they do sexual abuse on somebody else. It's again, it's kind of like that control over you. Like I've got this power over you. Like I'm controlling you, type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be used in bullying circumstances as well. Tony, were you going to come in there?
Yeah, no, I was going to say we had a young girl in the kids' home who didn't know how to speak in English. She was born here, but brother, grandfather, and father made sure that she didn't watch TV, didn't socialize with anybody, and she couldn't speak English. And the only way she could actually communicate with you was of her sexual nature. It was just like,
that
wow.
was the norm.
Yeah, and that's the bit.
Isn't it?
That was the bit because they would try to integrate her with other kids to try and show her how she was behaving. But it was her fault because at the end of the day she didn't know.
No.
She just didn't know. And it was just, you know, you can hear things about things like that, but actually see it for yourself. It was like, it blew my head. I ain't gonna lie, it blew my head.
No, and I really appreciate your honesty. I think that would be a really difficult thing for anybody, any worker to get their head around.
Struggled
Tony.
with that. Yeah. I worked with her for a whole year. Struggled. It was like, I didn't have to. I was out my depth. I ain't gonna lie. Seriously out my depth.
Yeah. Hopefully there was a package of support put around that, and
support was huge. The support was huge. There was always it was like male and female always worked together with her. And then because she would kick off if it was just two females.
Right.
And then if it was two males, she was overly it was like, wow, what have you done to her?
Yeah. Well, she sounds like an extremely damaged young person, bless her.
Yeah. It was crazy.
Yeah, and it just highlights the impact, doesn't it? You know, to think that, how old was that girl when she came to your environment, Tony?
She was only 8.
Oh God.
Yeah.
That's so sad.
But the worst bit was, it was like when they finished, they passed around the village. That was the worst bit.
Yeah.
It was it just did my head in. I was like, we hear about things, but I don't. I was just like, wow, really? You're just in the next village from me.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it can be very difficult to process that, and all I would suggest is to make sure, you know, if you're in a situation where it is kind of pushing your understanding, your just anything where you find
everything.
Yeah, I was just going to say that sounds challenging on so very many fronts, Tony, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
On a human and humanity level, that's a lot to process for anybody, and I would absolutely hope that you had the appropriate supervision while you were doing that.
Oh, we had supervision twice a week as a group, and then we had supervision with our deputy manager at the time, and she was brilliant. She was brilliant.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that, because I imagine that would have been invaluable for you at that time.
Yeah, it was, especially because my daughter was just born, and I had left when my daughter was born. I gave up the other job to go work with the kids, and I was like, wow, okay, it's just gone from one to the other. It was just like, wow.
Particular client groups can spark particular things in us at different points in our lives, I think.
Yeah,
you know, depending on what our own experiences are, I think, you know, certainly, especially if you're a new parent or, you know, you've had another child. I know that me and my partner struggle to watch things about little people these days because our littlest is 3. And if there's any TV programmes on about terrible things happening to little people, then we stay clear massively because it's too much. It's too much.
I bet. I remember
don't we? So, but if that imposes on our work life, then we have to make sure that support is in place for us to be able to manage that, and so we're not taking that home. Yeah. But thank you for sharing. That's really interesting because, like you say, when you experience that for the first time and meet somebody and work, you know, with somebody in that environment, that's really challenging and really eye-opening. But it's just as eye-opening to hear about somebody else's experience. So I'm sure that people certainly are, it's really interesting for me to hear about and see your, you know, hear your reflections about it. So I'm hopeful that the group feels similarly, that, you know, hearing that that has happened kind of just raises awareness a little bit. So thank you for that.
Okay.
So, neglect. Right. So neglect, whereas the other forms of abuse when we talk about children particularly are all actions. Neglect is an omission to act. Yeah, so that's what we talk about. So it's a failure to provide and meet those arguably basic needs of a child or young person, or indeed, you know, an adult if they've got care and support needs. If it's an adult at risk, then it's that act of omission. Anybody come across cases of this, or this has touched a part of their work that they feel they want to share?
Yeah, I do had a client, I had a GP where I was covering a satellite in Limehouse GP practice, and the GP came to me and was worried about a boy who'd come in, and he'd said he needed some morphine for his father, who was in palliative care but staying at home, because he'd run out. Now, the GP checked and made sure we had enough medication. So she asked me to come along and have a look too. So I saw this boy. The boy was sweating, shaking. He was completely unfocused. He was obviously in opiate withdrawals. And he'd obviously been taking the medication from his dad and using his dad's medication. Now they'd run out and he was trying to get some more. So we had to report that one.
Yeah.
It was an act of neglect because he supposedly, the boy was the father's carer, and he should have been controlling the medication, and he was taking it himself.
How old was he? Sorry, Chris.
He was early 20s, I think he was.
Right. Okay. So he's an adult in his own right.
He was an adult, yeah.
Yeah. No, just useful to have that information, isn't it? Because different things are at play sometimes.
Yeah, but he was classed as the father's carer.
Yeah.
And so part of his duties as a carer was to make sure his father got his medication on time. Yeah. And the son was taking the medication instead.
Yeah, absolutely. So loads of dynamics there, isn't there?
Oh, God, yeah. Well, in the end, we had to get the father into a home because the only person in the family looking after him was the boy, and then he had carers coming in, but then we couldn't leave him with the boy after that. So he went into, he didn't want to go, but once he was in there, he was happier.
Yeah.
Because he had more freedom. So obviously there was lots of other things going on there because he felt he had more freedom in the home than he did in his own home.
Yeah. Again, it's a bit about perception, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. And also, if people are under the care of somebody else, you know, and their lack of autonomy, if they're put in a position where they have a bit more autonomous about themselves and they're receiving the appropriate care and, you know, they're getting the care and support needs met, then arguably they're going to have a more fulfilled life potentially, aren't they?
Exactly, yeah. And the other problem was the boy had control of the father's credit card and bank card.
I was afraid you were going to go to the financial side.
Yeah. So there was lots of aspects to this safeguarding issue.
There always is, though. It's rare that you get something in isolation and you can hang your hat on it, deal with it and move away, isn't it? There's always a bit of unpicking to do, and it's never as straightforward as it looks, and arguably you feel like you're getting a grip of something and something else will pop up.
It always reminds me when you sort of chip it off a little bit of damaged plaster on the wall so you can repair it, and every chip you make, you get another crack, and in the end you've got the whole wall off. And it's a bit like that. You keep finding more and more as you delve into it.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to reflect on something that we kind of say about when, you know, we're going to schools and we talk about kids, and they kind of say, well, what, you know, when it comes to, we give them information about Childline and you know, being able to contact Childline if they've got a worry. And so people kind of go, well, what if you get prank calls? And we go, there's no such thing as prank calls. They're test calls. Yeah. And the same applies in your sense, is that sometimes people test the system, don't they? They might give you this much information, you know. So, and to see how you react to it, how do you deal with that, you know, without being personal, Chris, but, you know, can I rely on Chris? What's he going to do about that? If he finds out about this and well, oh right, no, I see him, he's a reliable person, he's done something, he's helped me, he's put the, you know, put this support in place for me, right, okay, I'll give him this, or he'll pick that, you know, like, and it's all that kind of stuff, isn't it? And it's about, some people test the system.
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, I think some of my clients over the years have been the most manipulative people I've ever met. But it's a survival instinct with them. You know, they're ostracised by society, they're neglected, they're criminalised by society because they have a habit. And so they will just do whatever they can and whatever they need to do to get what they need.
Yeah.
You know, if they're dependent on something, they will go to the ends of the earth to get it. And they can be extremely creative and very impressive.
Ingenious, I would suggest, Chris.
Exactly, yeah.
If we harness their kind of minds and focused it in the right department, they would be the most amazingly applied individuals, I suspect.
But I would say that. I said, you've got some amazing skills, you're creative, you're ingenious, you know. If you stick that into your recovery and focus it in that, you're laughing. You know, you're more equipped than most people.
Yeah, and a lot of the times I don't think that they see that, do they? Because they just see themselves as not.
No, I think with addiction you get very tunnel vision. Your drug of choice is at the end of that tunnel, and you don't really see much else other than ways to get it.
Yeah, and that can be challenging when you are in a caring role, can't it? And we'll kind of.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, everybody is a potential victim for that person to get what they want. Yeah.
Absolutely, because it's about getting their immediate needs met, isn't it? And if that's getting their next fix, and you're in the way, or you can facilitate them, then you're on a plate, aren't you?
Exactly. Yes.
Okie dokie. Financial material abuse. We've mentioned this just a minute ago, haven't we? About how what it might look like. And again, with your adults, this is fairly significant, isn't it? Potentially. That there's going to be some sort of abuse, whether they're the victims or they're the perpetrators. Like we said, drugs and money go hand in hand, don't they? Yeah, they need to fund their habits invariably, and how are they going to find that income stream? And as we said, they can be really creative. And we can look at that borrowing money and not repaying it. Hey, oh, somebody's old school ringtone's going. Is that you, Sia? Don't worry, do what you need to. Do you want me to switch you? I'll put you on mute and then you're sorted. Any comments?
Yeah, I've come across quite a few of these over the years. Usually start with emotional abuse, often with an elderly person living at home. Maybe it's mum, you know, and they've put her into a granny flat or whatever. Then they get manipulated and convinced they can't look after themselves. And that's when they start handing over credit cards, bank things, even to a point of giving, you know, affidavits and getting people to completely take over their affairs, you know, because they're convinced they can't do it themselves. And yet, I'm sure, given a mental capacity assessment, it'd be fine.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just gonna be back in a second.
No worries, Tony. Thank you. So yeah, absolutely, and we need to think about that. You know, we mentioned about the Care Act, but there's the Mental Capacity Act as well. We don't cover it on this training, but it is something to be really aware of. And there's 5 tenets that go along with the Mental Capacity Act, and the basic one of that is assuming capacity. You know, the point you raise on there, Chris, is they've been kind of walked into the fact and talked into the fact that then they can't do that anymore. So something they need help from another person. Well, invariably, they very much can do it. And they have got capacity, and we need to assume they have capacity unless we establish otherwise, because that capacity can be the difference, can't it? Whether somebody coming in and manipulating a situation and ultimately committing offences, you know, such as are akin to financial abuse.
And I think often it's perpetrated by, I say, might be a son or a daughter, saying, you know, an elderly parent that they're not capable anymore, and they obviously they're older people. They're not going to suspect their own son or their own daughter is going to do this. So again, they're vulnerable. Well, again, it goes back to that social conditioning, isn't it? To think, well, they're our children. You know, how can our children do that to us, or how can our neighbour do that to us? You know, somebody that's close to us that we form a relationship with, whether that's one out of family or, you know, a close, you know, a relative or friends or whatever that looks like.
is nobody wants to think the worst of those people. That they're,
No,
you know, these
exactly.
people come in with that caring hat on and going, I want to help, and how can I help? And this is, you know, this is what I'm going to do to help. How can that person possibly have negative motives? You know, we don't want to believe it, do we?
No, exactly. Yeah.
Who wants to believe that somebody would manipulate us and use us like that? It's a horrible, horrible thing to have done. And you can imagine how any type of abuse, but you know, when I think about somebody coming in your home and perpetrating themselves as somebody's helping hand, how much of trust that must erode within you, you know, of the people you're around. You know, how can you trust anyone if your judgment is so off about that relative, that friend, that carer, you know? You can appreciate that has quite a massive impact on people. Right, so moving on, we're getting on to the indicators bit, and I do want to try and rattle through a fair bit of this. We're just up to 1:15, and I appreciate we need another break, but I am really conscious of time and we've lots to get through. So I'm just going to rattle through at a fair pace with these indicators. And what you can do is have a check off on your list of the things that you made your notes of in the last break as to whether you've got them. If you haven't, make a note of some more. I can always, you know, we can always refresh these at the end of the session if you didn't make the notes that you'd like. But I am just really conscious of time. So we're going to have a look through. These are the red flags. These are the things that we might see that might lead us to believe that this type of abuse is going on. So anybody, first of all, let's have two different indicators. Just give me one. Somebody pipe up and give me one indicator for emotional and psychological abuse that you came with.
The person might be quite withdrawn.
Withdrawn, thank you, Frankie. What else?
Anxious.
Anxious, Steph. Yeah, absolutely. Again, those kind of indicators that are emotionally based. So let's have a look. And a lot of them, what we'll see is crossover, don't they? So when we talk about somebody being withdrawn, then that can be an indicator of a number of different things, can't it? But yeah, certainly. So it mentions on there the social isolation, the withdrawn bit there. Yeah. Any comments or queries on that one? I think it's worthy of note of kind of, you know, we're looking at our internal emotions, and when I talk to the kids, I talk about, you know, the physical abuse being the abuse on the outside and the emotional abuse being the hurt on the inside. And I think when we look at this, is about the internalization of a lot of these feelings. When it talks about on here about low self-esteem, and it talks about and employing coping mechanisms like self-harm. It's about somebody seeing themselves as not being worthy of something, isn't it? It's about somebody who's had that self-esteem eroded, and they don't feel good enough, and so, you know, kind of what's the point, and bring about all those different coping mechanisms. Talks about drug and solvent abuse, which is absolutely right, isn't it? Another coping mechanism, arguably. Yeah. All right. So indicators of physical abuse. Somebody give me one of those.
Right.
Bruises.
Francesca, was that you?
I said bruises.
Bruises, yeah, a good one, and we'll have a look at what types of bruises, because it's not going to be every type of bruise that's going to worry us necessarily, but there's some significant ones, aren't there? So bruising is key. What else?
Discomfort, pain.
Maxine first, and we'll come to Steph. Sorry, Maxine, what did you say?
Feeling frightened. You can develop like a shake in your hands.
I think you can develop lots of physical manifestations of, you know, of our anxieties. Yeah. So if we're saying that being around a certain person, you know, if they're the perpetrator of abuse, then that might manifest itself in a physical sense, mightn't it? In a cowering, in a withdrawing, you know, those types of things. Is that what you meant?
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Maxine. Steph, what were you mentioning?
Pain, discomfort, you know, wincing or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it might be we talk about bruising, but it could be pain of all different varieties, can't it? Yeah, and that flinching, that kind of disorder. Unconscious reactions, maybe.
Yeah.
Tony, what were you saying?
Nervous disorder.
Yeah, can be extremely nervy, can't they? Anybody suffering with abuse. Let's put them up for you. We'll have a look at the bruising on the next slide because we'll discuss kind of what's going to worry us and what's not. Anything on there that kind of anybody wants to mention? Last group we talked about that fabricated or induced illness. Has anybody come across that in their client group before?
Oh yeah.
No.
Yes.
Go on, Chris.
Well, it's usually I've had 3 cases that all went to CP in the end, but it was the kids not coming to school because they were being told they were being bullied, and they were completely stressed out and didn't want to go to school, and it turned out it was his stepfather in all 3 cases.
And what was the issue? What was happening?
He wasn't going to school, and I got a call from the pastoral advisor in the school, and welfare officer in the other 2, saying he's not coming to school. They're saying they've been saying the same sort of things, and they tried to refer to CAMHS because they first of all believed the stress stress aspect of it. But when we went around there to view and see them at the school, it came out that the stepfather in 2 cases had histories of violence, and the other one, the father came in and just said no, he fell over in the playground, and I had to take him home, and he wasn't well enough for school. But again, and it was much later, it was weeks later before we realised it was the stepfather again.
Right. Okay. So the signs of physical abuse and it wasn't.
Yeah. Well, obviously, there was bruising.
Passed off as something else.
It was bruising. So obviously, they didn't want the kid to go to school because they didn't want the school to see the bruising.
Absolutely.
So they just made out the child was unwell.
Yeah. Joan, were you going to mention something before? Sorry.
Yeah, I worked with a family, the same sort of situation where the child wasn't attending school daily. Their attendance dropped down to 40%. Mum would continually report that child was unwell, was visiting the doctors, and so forth. But then it turns out that Mum had a history of attending the doctors for herself, reporting various sort of concerns. And it just transpired that she was putting all that sort of pressure onto her son as well. But there was huge concerns, and that itself went to child protection as well.
Had the child been reported in terms of, had they gone to the doctors and purported that the child had different illnesses and?
Yeah, so the child was attending the doctor's surgery as Mum would take him, but the doctor would report that there was no issues whatsoever, and they could never sort of match with what Mum was saying. But
Right.
then also when although the child's attendance had dropped, the child was attending school on some occasions, but even like the teachers would report that they had found that there was no concerns with his well-being at all.
Yeah. So, and it can be, it can be really damaging.
Yeah, very damaging. Yeah.
There's cases, I mean, it doesn't sound like your young person had any treatment on the back of it, Joan, which is a relief.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's cases where, it's bound to be fabricated induced illness, what used to be called Munchausen syndrome.
Yeah.
And children have had extremely, and I'm sure there'll be adult cases out there as well, don't get me wrong, but they've had extremely invasive procedures and courses of treatment. There was one girl that I remember hearing about that had a full range of chemotherapy, and treatment for cancer. On the back of a parent's say-so, and she never had cancer. So it just shows, and as we know, chemotherapy and cancer treatments can obliterate your immune system, and that's the whole design about it, and that's a good thing if you've got cancer, because hopefully that's obviously there to counteract it. But if you don't have that in the first place, what a damaging thing to happen to you. So I find it quite fascinating, the fabricated and induced illness side of it. I don't think as practitioners we come across it a lot, but it's interesting that we have got some experience in the room, because I think it is one of those that, again, because we don't come across it a lot, we have to challenge our thoughts and our processes when we do come across something, to make sure that we don't miss it out.
Yeah.
Okie dokie. So when we're talking about bruising, a lot, I talk about this on my kind of sports element of it when I'm training coaches up in safeguarding and whatnot, and we talk about it. It's all the bruises that we're used to was obviously his knees, his shins, his elbows, it's all your bony bits, isn't it, that kind of stick out. Anything that is the fleshy bits, so the back of your legs, the back of your bum, your back, your face, your neck, your face, you know, any of those bits that are coming up, then that's going to be red flags, isn't it? It's quite hard to bruise those bits off you. And so we need to be mindful of that. We also, it might be particular shapes of bruising that might give us cause for concern. So it might leave a mark, you know, if it's on your arm, if it might be a band, if we've been struck by something, or we also need to be mindful of kind of finger marks as well, if we're being grabbed and that type of thing. Anybody got any experience of this with client groups and stuff?
Yeah.
What? Who was that?
Oh, sorry. Was
that in you in your outside universe, Tony? Did you take us with you on a rocket ride then? By goodness. Go on, what's your experience with this, Tony?
It was my foster son. He was being physically abused by his dad, and his dad would only beat him in places or hit him where you wouldn't obviously see it.
Yep.
And it was only because of that Monday when he hadn't had his PE stuff and he knew he was going to get a week's detention. So he came over to us, and I just told him to go upstairs and go and get Travis's tracksuits and stuff and just wear that. But it was taking forever. And then when I went up there, and that's when I saw it on his back, all over his back, and it was just like, wow. So, the thing is, I've known that boy for ages. Known it for ages. I just didn't know that was going on. And he hit it well, though.
Yeah.
He hit it really well.
Well, victims can be ashamed as well. And it's not that they're colluding and they don't want, but they, you know, it depends who the perpetrator is as well. They might not want to get them into trouble. They might love them still, you know, just because because they're victims of abuse doesn't mean that they don't have positive feelings attached towards their perpetrator as well, and they want to protect them and they want to love them and they still want to be part of their lives, and they might recognize that actually if they were to be explicit about something and show somebody the impact that might have. So there's lots of different conflicting feelings that go along with it, I imagine.
Yeah, it wasn't straightforward at all.
No, it really is. But yeah, so whether if somebody's avoiding being seen in certain circumstances, to Tony's saying in a PE kit, a lot of the times when we see kids in football, if they're wearing full-on skins, you know, at this time of year when we've had the weather we have, and if they're tipping up and you're kind of like, frankly, you know, I can't see an inch of the skin hardly, even though it's really warm. You know, it's all about those kind of converse indicators, isn't it? To kind of go, right, well, why aren't we seeing all of them? Or why, you know, why won't they wear that? And we need to be considerate of that, but we need to, I think, you know, what possibly could be at play. So, indicators of sexual abuse. Let's have a couple of ones that you had on your list.
Inappropriate sexual behaviour.
Yep. So
promiscuity.
Yeah, and that's not commensurate with that child's age, if you're thinking of kind of children and young people.
Again, I think sometimes with children, it can be inappropriate sexual displays or of affection or taking it further.
Yeah, something that's overly sexualised that we wouldn't expect from a child or a young person. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Steph. Anybody else? One more, come on.
Complaining of like pain or displaying signs of like irregular bleeding and things, what you wouldn't necessarily expect from a younger child.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we can talk about kind of behavioural indicators, but there's also physical indicators, isn't there?
Yeah, FGM.
Yeah, so we've got complaints of pain. You know, it might be bruising on the inside of the legs. You know, there might be all sorts of kind of physical signs, mightn't there? And like you say, if it's a younger child that's displaying, you know, any sort of bleeding, obviously that wouldn't be usual.
Yeah.
Then there's lots of different.
Be one.
Say that again.
Could pregnancy be one?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a pretty significant indicator, that, Maxine, isn't it? Yeah. It is, isn't it? But you know, if it's one that is, especially from a child who can't give consent, obviously that's a concern straight up, isn't it? Because if they're not old enough to be able to give consent, then potentially there's a criminal act that's happened in the first place, and that will arguably be abusive. But certainly, you know, if they're a child or young person that we aren't aware is engaging in sexual activity or shouldn't be, or, you know, whatever the background to that is, then yeah, if they become pregnant, then we need to be having an explore of that a little bit more as to how that's come about, don't we?
Was there a case? Sorry, was there a case a couple of years ago with a baby had been abused and they found out because it contracted an STD?
Right. Yeah, no, I vaguely recall that.
Yeah, yeah.
Loads of different indicators, isn't there, that we can come across? You know, if we can't add one up and get two, you know, how can a baby otherwise you know, come across something like that? Is it, you know, is it an acquired thing? Do they have it from birth? You know, is it a genetic issue? And I'm not saying an STD would be, but do you know what I mean? Once we've ruled out certain elements of something, then
it's a bit
we've
obvious.
got to start exploring, haven't we?
Yeah.
As grim as it might be, it's not a pleasant subject, let's be honest. Sorry, we're going a bit heavy-end and a bit grim before lunch, guys. I'd like to say it gets cheerier on as the day goes on, but I'm not. I can't promise that. Is all I'm saying. But unfortunately, these are all parts of our job, aren't they? And all things that we need to have an awareness of as frontline workers and as those that are working in, you know, in service-based industries and such that we do. So pregnancy's on there, Maxine, as you said. We've talked about pain, bleeding, all that type of stuff. Inappropriate sexual knowledge or behaviour, as you mentioned, Steph. I had one case where the girl just wanted to make herself as repulsive as possible, so she didn't wash. She was absolutely humming.
Make herself unattractive.
Yeah. In order to repel the perpetrator, so she just didn't wash. She was honestly, and teenager, you know, she was reeked with hormones, so she would, you know, she smelled special. But that was her defence mechanism. She thought if she smelt that bad, he wouldn't come anywhere near her. So your poor personal hygiene, you know, comes under that. It can be, you know, those coping mechanisms. What can I do? What have I got in my control to prevent this terrible thing happening to me again?
The reluctant to undress. I worked with an SEN boy, 9-year-old boy, and he was the opposite actually. It was quite often he would stand up in a room full of people and strip off, make very inappropriate comments and signs of sexual acts and things as well. And unfortunately, they could never. He was in. He had a foster carer, and unfortunately, by the time that they realised this behaviour and things that he was doing, there was a pattern with it, which led to them to believe that he'd been sexually abused for quite some time and sold out by his parents for drug money. They couldn't actually prove it to arrest the parents because of the fact that after 7 days, there's no physical signs.
Yeah.
So although this young boy had to go through the process of obviously being medically examined, they couldn't prosecute them because it'd been left too late, basically.
Yeah. And that's horrible to hear, isn't it? And that must have been really challenging to work on a case like that, Frankie.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think, you know, the human being us wants some consequences, doesn't it? We want some action to be taken. We want there to be something.
Yeah, when he was having weekly contact with his parents, and because they hadn't been prosecuted, that it couldn't be stopped until thankfully. Yeah, well, I say thankfully, but it was terrible for him because he couldn't accept it. But Mum stopped having the contact because she declined as far as the drug use was concerned, to a point where she didn't bother. And Dad's gradually got reduced because of the impact of him having continual contact with them when it was likely that he was going to need to be adopted further down the line. So they did gradually reduce that contact, which was only a positive because of the conditions in which the parents were living in. And the behaviour and the things that they would have been subjecting him to. It was realised later down the line it was good that actually, although it was not good for the parents, it was good for the child that contact was reduced.
Yeah, clearly. Absolutely. And sometimes it's not the way we would want it to be done, and it's hard and it's challenging, isn't it? When you are aware something's going on, but if you can't prove it, then you can't stop those visits. You can maybe put different parameters in place for them, but
it's
not
particularly hard with SEN children, and unfortunately, as I'm very sure you're aware, they are seen as a higher target for sexual abuse, particularly because they do have more often than not the struggles of how to express what they're experiencing and going through, and the lack of understanding that obviously it's not something that is acceptable behaviour, and so because they don't understand it, they can't challenge it, nor can they make it known to other people. More often than not, they are quite a big target.
Absolutely, and inherently, vulnerable, aren't they?
Very.
Perpetrators of abuse, and it is so very worrying when you come across cases like that. But again, one to have in our consciousness, isn't it? And to kind of have those alarm bells ringing in our ears.